All right, welcome to the Sae Bae cast number 184 with Mod Ash for round two. Mod Ash, how are we doing this fine Saturday?
Hi there, I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for having me back so soon. And how are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for asking. So, just to start off, because I think we're both a little concerned that there will be some commenters saying, like, what's up with Mod Ash's mic quality? Your laptop wasn't picking up your mic. That's correct?
Yeah, we tried rebooting, tried all the settings it had, can't seem to get it to pick up my voice at all. Don't know what that's all about, but don't want to lose the day, so I'm on a mobile phone. Not quite as good, but it should work at least so we can get this thing done.
Yeah, it's definitely doing the job. I think it actually sounds much better than I would imagine a mobile phone sounding. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. Now, I will just tell a little backstory for those that maybe are listening to this episode and didn't hear the first one. There was part of my audience that was a bit disappointed in our first conversation, and I think most of that disappointment came from a small group of people that have honestly followed you for years and have probably listened to earlier podcasts you've been on, and they're probably on Twitter a lot, and so they've seen like all your responses to basic RuneScape questions, and they felt that I could have done a better job interviewing and I could have resisted some of the temptation to cover Twitter topics. On my end, I just saw it as I offered topics, or I offered a place to get topics, and I felt like it would be rude of me not to cover the ones that were listed. And so for me, it was a bit of a coin toss as to whether we should just deep dive into some of your stories or just cover what the community wanted to hear. But it sounded like most people want to just hear some good stories from Mod Ash. And there were also a lot of really pleasant comments saying how much they enjoy just listening to you talk about the game and stuff. So I'm really, really excited for this round two. Should be a little bit of a different vibe. I definitely have some questions lined up for you as well that are coming from myself. And I also resisted getting any Twitter topics for this. So this is just me and you right now.
Well, after all, if the first one covered a lot of the Twitter topics, and um, people want to hear other stuff as well. The great thing is, why not have both? So here we are again.
Yeah, and I honestly, I was super, super excited because you did reach out to me and offered to come back on, which was just a real treat for me because, yeah, I don't know. It just, I was just really appreciative of that. And so this ended up working out really nicely. It's only been 10 episodes since, so it feels like really short coming, but yeah, I think the audience will really love this. So first things first, I want to congratulate you on 20 years at Jagex. I think you said yesterday was your 20th anniversary. Is that correct?
That's right. I started on 12th July 2004 back in the support team. And of course, hitting a anniversary like that felt like it might give an extra reason to schedule the return call around now rather than any other week of the year.
Yeah, this works out really, really nicely. That is so crazy. 20 years at one company. So what I mean, I have a bunch of different branching off questions just from this alone. What decade was faster, do you think? Like which decade went by faster? The first decade or the second decade at Jagex?
I think the second one went faster, but every year has felt different from every previous year just because things change, game change, staff change, um, team grows. There's always something new. So it hasn't felt like 20 years of the same thing. It's felt like just one thing after another, after another, after another. And there's always more to come. So it doesn't even feel like a, milestone. It's just another thing that happens on the way to whatever the next thing will be for RuneScape.
And how likely are we to see a 30th anniversary at Jagex for you?
Well, the guys of my family seem to get towards 70 easily enough. So, and I'm not job hunting. So, you never know. I might well still be here. There's nothing else I've got planned at the very least. Um, and of course, things change. and that includes opportunities at Jagex. After all, the RuneScape team back when I joined it was, OG developers like Mod Dylan, who's with us again now, by the way, and Mod Titan and Paul Gower, etc. And a lot of them, a lot of the people who were the experts when I joined the dev team, they accepted opportunities elsewhere at Jagex, working on things like the MechScape project, which where all the cool kids wanted to be. And, you know, if I'd ended up going down one of those branches, maybe I wouldn't have hit 20 years at Jagex because a lot of them didn't. Um, in fact, I don't think anyone who went down the MechScape route is still with Jagex, which is sad because they did some darn fine work there that never got launched. But that's
So
another story.
let's actually get into that because that was something I glanced over on the first episode. I had never even heard of MechScape. And so for me, when you had mentioned that, I was like, oh, I don't even know I have no idea what to even ask about that. But I've done a little bit of research, a little bit of Wikipedia searching on what MechScape was. And apparently it was going to be like a shooter, like a RuneScape type shooter. Is that correct? And we can definitely deep dive into that. And just explore exactly what it was intended to be and why it failed to launch.
Gladly. So, MechScape was science fiction. It was set around planets in a system a long way away, where you would play as one of four races: Mortiga, Pligi, Impeti. I think can't remember the fourth one. Might have been human, and you would transition between character scale, walking around as your character in an environment, or vehicle scale, where you were, well, depicted as the vehicle driving around a different scaled environment, perhaps at a different pace. It was going to be written in the RuneScape game engine, which of course would get more features for the purpose, as it has done for RuneScape, but completely separate content, and it would be its own world designed from the ground up by people who'd got some experience working on games, working on RuneScape, and they really were among the best of the RuneScape team. Mod James, who wrote Fremnic Trials and Desert Treasure, Mod Bennett, who wrote RuneScape 2's combat system, and Devious Minds, actually, although I don't think that's his proudest thing. He wrote that one because he was told he had to write a quest, and he did so. But oh, and I think young Ian Gower even, they were moved off from RuneScape to work on MechScape, which Jagex and all of us hoped would be the next great thing, so that Jagex will be the proud publishers of two successful games, RuneScape and, well, it wasn't going to be launched under the name of MechScape. It was internally pretty clear that it was going to launch under the name like Stellar Dawn. And when development became troubled and the executive in charge of it left, the simplest thing to tell the public seemed to be that we'd canned MechScape in favour of doing Stellar Dawn, but to some extent, Stellar Dawn was always more like to be the launch title of the thing worked on under the working title of MechScape. So there was a bit of branding going on there. Anyway, they worked for quite a long time, and well, I think it honestly could have launched if Jagex had still wanted to. But by the time we're getting near 2010, 2011, the company's changed hands, and suddenly what Jagex wanted became very, very different very quickly. So it went nowhere. That's a real shame. I would have loved to get my hands on it myself as a player, or see what the general public made of it if they got to it.
Is there any chance of that being brought back or a concept like that? Have you guys ever talked about that in the team internally?
Most of the old school team as we see these days wouldn't really have come across it. I mean, very few were adults when all this was going on, frankly, because we're talking 15 years ago, a lot of it. And no, it's not something we talk about. I would expect that archives of it are still held by Jagex because I mean, it's amazing what Jagex doesn't seem to have an archive of if you look at old versions of RuneScape, frankly. But I would be surprised if we didn't still have a tape somewhere with MechScape on. That said, while there were hundreds of thousands of people clamoring on an online petition to get an old version of RuneScape, um, it's not so clear that if Jagex went to the time and trouble of digging out MechScape, it would pull the same kind of audience.
Yeah, there's
And
no chance.
yeah, there's a lot of games written on more modern technology to compete against. And so bringing out a game with all the legacy technology hurdles that the RuneScapes have, but without the name RuneScape, feels like it might really not pull a whole lot of attention. I mean, sure, it would be from, to some extent, from the Gower brothers, because Andrew oversaw the design philosophy of it, and Ian worked on it hands on properly as for years. But I mean, frankly, if somebody wants to know what the Gower brothers would really like to serve them, we'll find out later this year when they launch their own game.
Yeah, I'm very excited for that. So
Oh, right.
there is you mentioned Jagex being sold during that time, and it the change in hands made it difficult to continue this project. I want to ask actually about that. So, how much do things actually change around the office when Jagex is sold to different companies? And have there been any owners that you've disagreed with? I don't know how much is changing around when there's those huge transitions, but I'd love to hear it.
I think the biggest change came when our founders, the Gower brothers, sold us to our Inside Venture Partners, IVP. That was the most noticeable change of the various purchases we've had. Now, MMG, Mod MMG, Mr. Gerhard, he was CEO under Andrew, and he remained CEO under the new owners. And the impression I was getting at the time was that while he was Andrew's best mate and CEO, he was fully committed to Andrew's vision for the company that Andrew largely owned, which I mean, you'd expect. A CEO is meant to be reasonably aligned with their owner's vision. Now, when we were sold, when IVP increased their minority stake to a majority stake, suddenly MMG might get to bring forward his vision where it had differed from Andrew's. And one of the things that turned up very big in 2010 was the opportunity to write the Transformers game. This would be done on license from Hasbro. And if Jagex could release a Transformers MMO of some sort, it would have been, a very big deal because we wouldn't just be launching on the internet with, from the creators of RuneScape. We'd be partly creators of RuneScape, but also with Hasbro's entire marketing budget behind us, tied to the release of Michael Bay movies. And this would be a very significant impact on, everybody's advertising input. So I could see why somebody who thinks they can land that contract is going to say they want to pursue that one rather than writing their own sci-fi game that is still from the creators of RuneScape, but won't have Hasbro's backing. So I could really see why he might have thought that if the founders were no longer around pushing their Stellar Dawn concept, maybe he could take Jagex to do something even bigger. And of course, as you know, there isn't a Transformers game created by Jagex that everyone's playing for years to come. That fell apart after a few years. And around that time, the resignations of everybody, MMG included, so it went all the way to the top. All the senior brass left. And IVP became quite keen to sell us on. So, well, you asked about what kind of impact it makes when we change ownership.
Yeah.
The thing is, once Transformers had come and gone, it was pretty clear that the next priority is okay, let's look after RuneScape then. And I say next priority because in 2014, the chief financial officer, who also left in the big end of Transformers cull, he stood up at the beginning of the year and said, it's 2014. What's the top priority? Transformers. What's the next priority? No, not RuneScape. Transformers. What's the third priority? No, not Old School RuneScape. Transformers. A funny guy he was. He he was grinning. It's like he'd been to improv classes or something. Anyway, so that was the priority in 2014, and at the end of 2014, a batch of 90 people had been made redundant. So a batch of about 40 people were made redundant. All the senior brass had resigned, and Transformers was officially dead. So with that gone, the next owners weren't going to try and take us in a new direction with a new game. They were going to, try and, well, see what could be done with RuneScape. Now, the next owners, they were variously known as Zongji or Fukong. I honestly never managed to keep track of what their official name was, and it's possible that Fukong was owned by Zongji. They were based in mainland China, and I believe their background was in mining. I think there's a lot of mining in RuneScape, but it's not the same. And I mean, what I was reading at the time, because we're talking 2015-16, was a lot of Chinese firms wanted to park their assets in relatively stable currencies like the dollar or the pound. So they were buying American or British companies just for the sake of owning something that would hold its value. And that way their assets would be in some way protected, even if they had no obvious connection to the running of those companies. And of course, as owners, they could help themselves to whatever dividends they fancied. And I'm given to understand they duly did. Of course, that sale was finalised I think, on the morning of the Brexit referendum results. And for those who follow the dollar-pound exchange rate like I do, that was a fascinating day because the pound slumped massively from what had usually been a pretty stable $1.5 to something more like 1.2. And it's been bouncing around there, give or take, ever since. So I did always wonder whether if they bought us to own something that's got its value in pounds, would they have felt really, really hard done by? Oh, I'll never know, of course. And their opinion of the Brexit referendum is somewhat immaterial because it was 9 years ago and they're not British. But I did wonder whether they might have bought themselves a very, very bad bit of timing there, poor saps. Anywho, so yeah, the focus under them was still very much RuneScape, but of course some interest in whether we could write anything else on the side. Nothing, of course, on the scale of Stellar Dawn or Transformers was kicking off, though. And beyond them, when Carlisle bought us, I'd say the most notable difference is that suddenly all the network infrastructure and server infrastructure that we'd wanted upgrading for years finally started being upgraded. So that was a nice improvement. We've been bought again more recently. I have yet to experience the effects from this one, but our various managers are in discussions about opportunities they think would be worth pursuing. I've thrown in a few suggestions about things they might like to think about as well, like maybe if they want to expand to more markets, maybe some more game worlds in more territories would go down a treat. Lord knows players keep asking for it, so there's got to be some interest here. So we shall see what they want to do, but they're not throwing their weight around massively in the initial months.
How much of the conspiracy theories that we hear around the community are true about like the higher ups kind of, controlling the team, and that the team can't speak out about certain things because the higher ups don't want anything to be discussed publicly and stuff. Like, is there any sort of element of control where, we're not seeing it as the community, but there is a little bit of oppression happening in the team?
Logically, you could never know whether to trust any answer I give you to that question, But truth is, they don't all come in saying, "Well, we've bought you, and we've decided we want to do this with the game. There should be, more dragons. We want to see the Dragonkin come back and do a white dragon and frost dragons. We like those, and also there should be a tie-in with." Oh, I don't know. What would be Barbie dolls? There should be more Barbie dolls in RuneScape because Barbie dolls are popular. We want to do that. New owners don't come in acting that way so far. At least none of them have. If anything, the only ones that turned up and really shook things around were IVP all those years ago at the start of end of 2010 when they came in and we duly dropped Stellar Dawn in favour of focusing on Transformers. And I don't think that was necessarily from them in the first place. I think that's what Mod MMG wanted to do. Now he was CEO under owners who weren't the founders. So, in all likelihood, that came from him anyway, and they were backing him rather than being the people who'd imagined it. But that's just my theory, because because the community's got conspiracy theories. So do I. Staff speculate, and ultimately, what gets said between the CEO and the rest of the board is something that they don't publish. But honestly, my experience has been that they buy RuneScape because it's running quite well. Maybe they've got some thoughts about how they could make it run better. Carlisle, for example, seemed to think that if we were allowed to do some of those systems upgrades, it might run even better. And they'd be right if so. And full credit to whoever at executive level or above went to them with an explanation for why spending that money would be better for the product they bought and got them to agree to it. Because I'm pretty sure that's how decisions ultimately get made.
Yeah, and I'm grateful for it as a player, so that is nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think honestly what I'm seeing is people trying to work out what opportunities there are to make things go better. Like I say, that could mean trying to find new audiences. You remember a few years back, RuneScape Old School launched on Steam, and before that, we launched on mobile devices. And RS3 duly they went on mobile devices a bit later. A lot of these things are people looking for new opportunities to just take the game further, make the game stronger, build up the audience, let the existing audience play it in even more flexible ways and in more places. You can imagine somebody saying, "You know what would really drive this game forward? Playing on the Switch." And maybe there's some world where suddenly that becomes the next big thing we're all focusing on. I've seen players ask for it, which is partly why it springs to mind. I don't think it'd be ridiculous. On the other hand, my personal vote, if I had one, and I might have a bit of one, would be to keep improving the mobile platform offering, get more of the client features on it that people want, and then maybe have, happier customers on mobile than we do now, more customers on mobile because it'd be a more appealing game to play on mobile, and build on what we've got because there's a lot more could be done with it. Even portrait mode that might make the game more playable on mobile for more people and take it further without all the hurdles that come from addressing an entirely new platform from scratch.
Yeah,
But that's just my imagination.
that would definitely be the priority and the way to go. Do you think this is just a? I'm just curious because I believe you guys have partnered up with RuneLite to some extent. Is there any chance that we're going to get RuneLite over on mobile, or is that just not a feasible thing that's ever going to happen?
We put out a blog a few months ago now, I suppose. It was earlier this year anyway, in which we talked about not just HD, but about the possibility of our own plugin API that would let players crowdsource client features on mobile. Well, we were talking mostly about our enhanced client, the C++ client, which is available in our launch as the new official client. But such plugins, if they come to fruition, would also be available on mobile where applicable. So that's the current plan for how to get players that kind of feature on mobile devices and also in our C++ client. I think it would be more likely done in that kind of way.
It feels like, for the most part, the team is aware of the really good plugins that people can't live without, and we're already seeing a lot of them transferred over to mobile. So I also know that like RuneLite on the PC, at least, it's so quick, like just the turnover rate of just like boom, here's an update, here's the plugin for it within hours. It seems like I don't think that would even be possible on a mobile device, especially with Apple. I'm pretty sure Apple has like a bunch of delays and stuff when you're trying to update the game. So it might.
We certainly noticed that engine updates these days have to go through Apple's approval process, and to be sure, it hasn't always gone smoothly. There have been times when our game updates a day later or something for reasons connected to that. They have a lot of rules. We have a lot of legacy content that was not designed with those rules in mind, about things like how a button must behave or where you can put things on the screen. When to launch on mobile in the first place, we had to go through a lot of the game, spotting where old existing content was not going to be compatible with a mobile layout or with Apple's particular rules or Android's rules. By the way, they've got some and all. And bonds. I think we weren't allowed to refer to bonds on Apple devices for a while. Rules change. We now can. We're grateful. Much better for the players. Good for us too. Probably good for Apple, frankly. So it just these things do take more time, as you say. But most kinds of updates, content updates, don't need to go through that level of process because what's installed on the phone isn't changing massively. It's just loading slightly different content. So if we were to map down some new, I don't know, Araxite monsters with a new combat mechanic, it wouldn't actually involve updating the app in that way, just the content that the app displays. So there is actual hope that there'd be more flexibility and we'd be able to update more like the usual weekly cadence that people are used to.
One of the things I'm looking forward to is, the next 5-10 years where we are all, like, society as a whole are just wearing these goggles, like VR goggles, and we're just chopping trees with like the first person perspective. So what is that going to be happening in the next decade, you think? Or are we going to be playing with our headsets?
I really could see that kind of thing sitting in the home playing like that. The idea of walking around in public doing it, like Pokemon Go hunters, I have a little more trouble with that one because honestly, I'd expect that if I walked around, the city streets here with my phone out playing a game and focusing on the game rather than anyone around me, in all likelihood, somebody would snatch my phone and be gone before I could even see who they were because I wouldn't have seen them coming. I'd be looking at my phone. And I'd see that as a very quick way to lose some fairly expensive kit fairly quickly. Now, expand that to a VR headset. I think you'd be even more isolated to the point that you might not be safe in public. And I mean, if I could afford one of those things, I wouldn't sit in the street with it.
Yeah. But at home, maybe we'll see.
And I don't even live in a rough neighborhood, as far as I know.
Just imagine somebody actually just snatching that off of your head. Oh my god.
Yeah, that sounds painful and all. Yeah, I think technology may well go there. Maybe augmented reality where you see as though through your normal glasses, but there's a translucent image of a guy chopping a tree in your field of view that only you can see. Maybe that could be a thing.
Yeah, that would. I mean, you would see people out on the street with the whole culture of no XP waste. So that
Yeah.
I'm certain people would be chopping trees while crossing the street.
Yeah, last couple of weekends ago, I was up in one of the suburban villages around here, a place called Histon, and I was there to play a concert with a local choir, and I ran into a colleague passing by in a group of about 20 people. They were just walking around Histon, and he said they were on a Pokemon hunt. So, yeah, people will do these things in real life. It felt like a very random thing. I can't even remember what I was meant to be there playing, which is slightly embarrassing. Oh
Um,
well, I do a lot of random gigs these days.
okay. One of the things that we talked about in our last conversation was the Falador massacre, and I want to ask if there have been in the last 20 years for you any other emergencies that you've had to attend to, and I'd love to hear some of those.
Oh, thank you. I do love this topic. So I was on call for 4 3/4 years, give or take. The Falador massacre was the first and most notorious of them by a long way, and rightly so, I think. But I stayed on call beyond that until, um, well, it was Jagex had formalised it so that on call went with the tax year for legal reasons, contracts and stuff. So I stayed on until I think the following. It was in March, about nearly 5 years later, and during that time, yeah, I got quite a lot of call outs. Most of them were fairly mundane. One or two stayed with me as sort of teaching examples for the next generation of call out staff. Um, Now, I made these notes at a time to sort of explain here's a situation and here's what you can do about it because you can't change what you'd want to change. Take Hattie the Fenris Wolf. RS3 had that as a seasonal temporary addition up in the Fremnik areas. And it was a wolf that turned up and spawned in an area. People could gather there and fight it. And it was only going to be available for a month or so. Now, when it was defined, it had quite a big range on its. It was the NPC was allowed to wander quite a distance from where it was spawned, so it could follow people, which probably seemed like a great idea at the time because why not? Well, we found out why not a couple of nights later when some enterprising players led it southwards and brought it to the Sears Village maple trees. At which point, a lot of players who'd gone there for woodcutting and weren't expecting a big ass wolf to turn up suddenly found themselves a little bit caught short. Now, it's debatable whether this was a bug. Either way, it was the support team learning about it in the night decided it was best if it didn't keep doing it. And people were dying. So they called me and I came in. One can't redefine an NPC's radius, wander radius, by a hotfix. They're not designed to redefine the NPCs like that, but they can change what code is executed when the NPC tries to shoot at people. So all I did was find the code for where Hattie attacks, and if Hattie detected that Hattie was no longer in the expected, no longer in what I felt to be an acceptable area, Hattie would teleport itself back up north and get out of Sears Village. Simple solution. Looks a bit unpolished because Wolf's being led south, firing all the way, and suddenly it just vanishes and reappears somewhere to the north. But for an emergency call out, that is acceptable. Um, oh, it's better than what was going on before, and players aren't going to be massively confused by it. So did that, and in the morning they could come back, and the developers who made it could come back and talk about whether they really wanted it to wander and how far, and update the configuration of the NPC via a proper cold fix at their convenience.
I'm actually
Um,
I'm actually
yeah.
kind of curious. Are there any NPCs in the game that just have an unlimited wander range, or at least like very very large?
Can't be unlimited, but Bob the Cat is the most famous example of one with a very large range. I think it sets 10,000 tiles, and if 64 tiles is about the width of Lumbridge, uh, that will take him over pretty much the continent. Uh, Nothing really stopping him from going anywhere. There isn't an actual gate stopping him, and players have been known to herd him as well.
I wanted to like. So you guys have started doing this thing called smart pathing with NPCs. Do you think that's going to be more common going forward? Where I believe some of the most recent pets as well have this smart pathing, where they follow you as if it was a player following, so they can navigate fences and stuff that you cross over nicely. Do you think this is kind of the new path you guys are taking for like NPCs going forward?
For NPCs where it's useful, especially a pet, yes. Same goes for a boss where we can now have a more interesting environment where the boss won't get just stuck on all the scenery all the time. So that's quite desirable for us. For generic ones like cows wandering around the field, it would make no difference, so we won't bother enabling it.
Mm,
The reason for not enabling it on NPC is that it takes more server processing to do the smart pathing. So if all the NPCs are doing that willy nilly, that's actually a bit of a waste of server capacity, and we'd rather let the processor focus on other things. But for NPCs where it's useful, um, I would expect to see it quite a lot for bosses and pets.
interesting. Okay, let's hear if there's any more call out stories.
Right, so dungeoneering. We're talking 2010 now. There was a lot from dungeoneering because it was by far the most complicated thing the team had ever produced. And they didn't have a lot of the hindsight that we now do have. I think one of the technical lessons I took away from watching what happened with dungeoneering was that their developers had a standard procedure that checked, is the player in a dungeon? And if the player was in one of their dungeons, they would consider it safe to do various things. Otherwise, they would deem the player to have left and leave the player alone. But that would detect any dungeon, and it didn't distinguish whether it was the dungeon they were thinking of. So the callouts I was experiencing from this, which, by the way, really complicated feature, and it's code I'd never seen because I didn't write it. Um, it was frequently running into bugs where the player was in a dungeon but not the right dungeon, and that's why it's malfunctioning. So, one of the examples, a party could complete two floors at once. You complete one floor in your party, and at the end of that, you get the reward, and there's a countdown. At the end of which you're all teleported to the next dungeon. And this went wrong because players could pause that countdown. So if you did that, everyone else would advance to the next floor, but you'd still be in the old one. And you'd then click to end the old dungeon a second time, at which point the game would find your party and they'd complete the dungeon they were now in because the game hadn't noticed it was a different dungeon from the one you were in. At which point the party completed a second dungeon for no extra effort. So I was called out about that. Now, what I did about it, according to my notes, was to take the script that moved players from one dungeon to the next and write a new version of it that remembers the ID of the dungeon that it expected you to be in, so that when the script is executed, it can see whether you're actually in the right dungeon. And if you're not, leave you alone, because you've clearly, whatever state you're in, you should not be messed around with by this. And that solved it. Now, that became useful years later when we were doing Chambers of Xeric. I wrote some of the initial infrastructure for that one, and one of the first things I made was a similar procedure that checks if you're in a dungeon. But rather than just saying check in a dungeon, I called it check in any dungeon. So it'll return true for if you're in any dungeon. But as a developer using that script, you know it's any dungeon, not necessarily a particular dungeon. And I wrote a second script that checks in this dungeon and therefore takes more inputs so it knows which dungeon we care about. But a developer faced with these two procedures is a lot more likely to know whether they're talking about any dungeon or a specific dungeon, just because the procedure's been named in clear English to tell you what it's checking. Something I learned from my former colleagues of 7 years earlier who hadn't had the advantage of this hindsight.
That I will say that is really nice to have that hindsight with a dev that's been around for a while. Like, you're pretty much invaluable when it comes to just being able to see potential flaws in coding, just having been
I
there for so long.
That was something I got in a very convenient way for me. You see, you know how one learns from mistakes?
Mm-hmm.
When I first moved to the dev team at the start of 05, I was the upload manager. They offered me the title of repository manager because it's, code repository administration, really. But when I told my mum I'd just been promoted to repository manager, she's got a medical background, so she sort of associated it with suppository manager and laughed at me. And so I had to kind of go back to the operations manager, Bob Fluffy, and say, I'm really sorry, but this new job title you give me sounds like something you put in your bottom. And he gave me quite a dirty look, which is fair enough, because I should have technically sucked up the repository and been a good little dev accepting what was handed out to me. Came with 2K pay rise as well. But anyway, he said, well, what do you want to be called then? So I suggested upload manager. And yeah, it stuck, and they're still called that to this day. Mod Rock is currently the upload manager for Old School, and Mod Easty does RS3. Anywho, I was brought into that role, and the upload manager or repository manager, their job is to merge changes from the work in progress code bases into the next release build, taking personal responsibility that what's brought in is the right stuff and what's excluded is the right stuff. And that, of course, means seeing the code change. Now, there's a lot of bug fixes going through because RS2, with the best will in the world, was written by people who are not familiar with RuneScript of that nature. It was a completely new version of RuneScript, and mistakes were made. Learnings hadn't been learned yet. So every week I'd have a dozen or so little bug fixes to merge through into the release build. And I sort of came up with the idea of having an in other news section, a news post where these might be listed, by the way. Anyway, so I'd see all these fixes. I'd see the buggy code and I'd see the fixed code as I merged the fix through. And I learned from a lot of these because I was seeing the same mistakes over and over. It's a very good way to learn. I've recommended seriously that people all take a turn at doing this as part of learning to be a developer, just so that they can also benefit from everyone else's mistakes rather than having to wait to make their own fresh ones. But yeah, it meant I got in slightly ahead of the game because when I started writing code myself, I didn't have to go through the same teething process that new developers did, just because I got everyone else's mistakes I could already have learned from before I went in there for real. It was great.
Were there any callouts in particular that you weren't able to fix on the spot, and it took maybe days to finally figure out like how to solve it?
Yeah, according to my notes, there was one where the Conquest minigame, so we're talking about 2011, I suppose. Uh, Conquest minigame, players would be disconnected from the game at the end of the match, and therefore didn't receive their prize uh, because they weren't credited for winning it because they disconnected. I got called out for that. I looked at it, looked at it, and concluded, I don't know what the problem is. I give up. And I left it and went home and told the support team, sorry, I know you called me in for an emergency. I can't solve it. But it's not that serious an emergency. Therefore, it can wait till tomorrow morning when the developer can come back in and have a look at it himself, which he duly did. And as far as I know, he fixed it. But no, the thing is, I just gave up and went home. Now, if it had been a more serious bug, such as an exploitable one, where players could gain unlimited rewards from it or something, or take items unfairly from another player via it, if I couldn't fix it, my mandate would be to turn the feature off so that the harm would stop for the rest of the night. And that would put the game in a fairly safe state until morning. I've done this a few times. I think one example, actually on Old School, involved Barbarian Assault. Now, we're talking 2015 here, I think, in the summer. I wasn't officially on call anymore, contractually, but the guy who got the call out told the support team member, I'm drunk. Here's Ash's phone number. And the support team member phoned me and said, "Hi, Ash. I got your phone number. There's an emergency in Barbarian Assault. Blah blah blah. Can you go fix it?" And I can't say I wasn't best pleased, but needed doing. So obviously went and see what I could do. And what I found was that players at the end of a Barbarian Assault wave, if they closed their wave completion notification screen in a particular way and then caused it to open again, they could get the points over and over again, repeatedly. Now, obviously, that's pretty darn serious. I wasn't going to try and unpick the spaghetti code of Barbarian Assault immediately. I mean, you need a quick solution that will just stop the players doing that in the immediate term. So what I did was turn off the rewards for Barbarian Assault so that nobody would get anything, and then lock Barbarian Assault so no one could go in it either, and do that as a hotfix, because that's quite quick to do. And that means that the emergency stopped. Now the feature is simply unavailable till morning with a fairly straightforward message saying, this is temporarily unavailable, come back another day. I mean, I then realised that I was still going to have to fix it properly some other time, and if I didn't do it that night, then it wouldn't get into the next cold fix for well over a week. So I then sat down for the next few hours to delete a chunk of the Barbarian Assault spaghetti code and write a much more simple version that wasn't prone to ambiguity about whether the player still needed their rewards or not. So it ends, there's a screen, you get your points. There isn't some weird code that detects if you click on the ground to make the menu close before pressing the thing that accepts it and tries to reopen it so you can get them again. That didn't need to be there, and it's a very, very odd implementation to go via detecting that the players clicked on the ground to close a menu. Anyway, so I did that. It took me a fair bit of the rest of the night, but it meant that in the morning, QA had something to test and get it into the next build, and the update could go ahead, and Barbarian Assault was back without this bug in it. But the important thing was first, turn off the feature, and then delve into the exact details of the cause.
What is the longest duration that RuneScape's been down for? Is it just a matter of hours, or has it been days potentially?
I think 26 hours in November 2022, I think it was, there was a catastrophic power failure at the UK data center. Didn't just affect us, by the way, took out all their clients. And that being quite fundamental to some of our services took out, the ability to log into the game. And since, it was a pretty big data center problem to lose all power like that, it was 26 hours before we could get things back again. Although the data center was, they did what they could in the circumstances. They got power back within a few hours, but the game wasn't designed for people to just pull the plug mid-flow. We have a lot of different systems connected to each other, each of which might have been left in a slightly invalid state. So they'd all need some checking to make sure they're going to come back up in a valid state. And then that will need to be done, that need to be checked to make sure they had to come back, and then bring back the next one that depends on the first one, and the next that depends on that. And the sysadmins actually have a kind of handbook for how to do this and the order to do these things in. But it's still a very lengthy process. And they hadn't had to go through it for real before. There's drills, but it's never quite the same. The game was offline for, I think, 26 hours over that incident. Eventually given 3 days of membership credit as in the form of a voucher, I think, in recompense for it.
I was gonna just, I'm very curious at what point I'm 26 hours is a long time, so I imagine some of the people in the company are kind of, a little bit nervous, a little bit freaking out. Do you think there would be a certain amount of time that would cause a serious detriment to the game's health if it was offline for a certain experience or a certain period of time? Like, I'd imagine almost like, if it was offline for a week, that would just do an absolute number to the game's health and player base.
I think so. One of the thing that would, if you try to log in one day and you can't, scuppers your evening or your day. But if it's back the next day, you get back into your habits again of playing. If, on the other hand, it's gone for multiple days and you're coming back each day and finding, still can't play, find something else to do. Still can't play, find something else to do. Eventually you're going to build up a habit of finding something else to do and maybe lose the habit of coming back to the game. So I think that's how you get the effect you're describing. Also, there's a question of whether you've lost stuff when it comes back.
True.
RS3 went through an unfortunate incident in about 2021, I think, where what was meant to be some routine maintenance led to a catastrophic problem where some players lost days, if not weeks, of their account progress. I'm very surprised, to be honest, that can happen to one game but not the other one. Because Old School was in that maintenance as well. It didn't happen to us. But RS3 was hit quite badly. It involved days of, not just hours, but days of the analytics staff trying to recalculate what players' account states should be in from whatever data could be scratched from any other services that weren't normally used in this way, and trying to make sure everyone's accounts were capable of logging in and were updated with recent gains. I didn't see a lot of the discussion up close, but it was a darn painful thing for those who were going through it. And the closest I was actually experiencing myself is that some of the Old School team had RS3 accounts that were affected by it. And while they mostly played Old School these days, they were still a little bit salty. So things that affect the players among the staff as well, and that will be part of the internal response. But of course, there's not a lot of point in standing in the office flapping. You'd feel really silly after a few seconds of it, and then you stop. So people get on with their jobs, but it is a very big sucker on the attention. You're not likely to focus on do your best work while you're also wondering about, the dumpster fire going on next door.
It's true.
Speaking of dumpster fires, we actually had a dumpster fire at Jagex once. Um, sorry, it's just sprung to mind, but it's one of the very few times when the fire alarm goes off and we find there genuinely is a fire. Now, deal is, fire alarm goes off, you all troop outside and assemble in the car park. Unfortunately, that's where the fire was, because the fire's the big dumpster in the car park. Probably somebody chucked a cigarette in it or something. So, unfortunately, the smoke had gotten into the building and triggered the fire alarm. And we were required by policy to go and stand by the fire and suck smoke while we waited to see if the building was safe. Now, of course, being fairly enterprising folks, some of the staff very kindly put the fire out while we were waiting because there wasn't anything else to do. But it did feel like one of the few moments where health and safety policy actually becomes more of a hindrance, especially as obviously the building got the all clear to go back in because the fire was clearly not in it. And we'd put out the fire. We all therefore troop back into the building and are completely obstructing the route that a fire engine has now tried to drive down because it also wants to come and have a look at the fire, but we're now all in the way going back in the building. It wasn't the finest moment for the fire procedures.
That's awesome. Oh my god. Okay. I'm very curious. Can you share some of the complexities of the Grand Exchange? I'm an Iron Man myself, so I don't really use the Grand Exchange. Haven't in years. But how does the team and like the Grand Exchange help ensure like a balanced economy? And have there ever been any major bugs in the Grand Exchange that have maybe gone unnoticed or noticed?
So the Grand Exchange doesn't really help ensure a balanced economy. It merely is the conduit through which the economy is balanced or unbalanced. That's not a very positive way of looking at it, but I don't think it's able to make balance happen if the underlying situation is not itself balanced. So the team will keep an eye on supply and demand for new items going into it, or items that appear to be very hot topics at any given time. And if it's noticing that, people are trying to buy lots and lots of the item and there's just not enough coming in, well, maybe that's just how the game should be. The item is scarce, prices will rise, maybe more people will bring the item into the game. Or maybe not everyone should be able to just buy the thing immediately, even if they've got the coins, because the item is meant to be rare. And at that point, we might leave it, or we might adjust the guide price, or we might decide that we do want to adjust the supply of the items coming into the game. What the Grand Exchange can do, however, is, for items which are bought in bulk, runes or something, it can throttle how fast an individual player is allowed to buy them. There's a 4-hour limit that players are very familiar with. Now, the reason that exists is that if there's 5,000 players trying to buy the item and only 20,000 of the item, well, that's enough for 4 per player. But the players might have put in much higher buy quantities. And the Grand Exchange has a sort of throttle so that it won't give the whole supply to just the first player it sees whose offer matches. It'll give them their quota and then give some to other players rather than giving more to that first one again. The purpose of that is to avoid monopolies. So that, if the item is scarce and there's only 20,000 of it and 5,000 players trying to buy, but the first player said they want to buy 20,000 of it, the Grand Exchange shouldn't just give that first player all 20,000 and tell the other 4,999 players, you got nothing. Ideally, it would distribute the items a little so that everybody gets a bit of something. Now, to the individual player, these throttles are just annoying because they don't see the total supply and demand. All they see is that they've got their quota, and it's going to be 4 hours till they can get more quota. So they will often ask if we'll just raise the limit or take away the limit so that I want 20,000 of the item, I should be given it. That makes sense. Well, yeah, but if there aren't enough to go around, there's going to be some throttling, and this is unfortunately what the Grand Exchange has for doing it. Ideally, it might use some kind of dynamic logic that assesses how many players want the thing and shares it out based on proportions of that. It does not appear to have that functionality for the moment. If the engine team had a little more time to tinker with it under the hood, we'd like that very much.
What would happen exactly if there were just no limitations? I mean, I know obviously there would be disastrous effects, but do you think there would be some sort of balancing out of that? Just being able to really just get as many as you actually wanted? Like, do you have, I don't know, like some sort of illustration in mind that could help point out how disastrous that could potentially be? I guess in my head, I'm just thinking for basic items, as long as you're the one paying the most for it, it seems like you should be the priority buyer, and everyone else that's not matching that just out of luck. What would be the effects of that?
It would mean, if you're paying significantly more than the others, sure, you're going to get your likely to be at least first served. But if a very rich player or group of players could absorb the entire supply of the things and nobody else can get them, I don't see it as catastrophic that thousands of other players can't get the items they want. But those players will have a less than positive experience playing. And that is something we prefer to avoid, even if it's not a catastrophe.
Interesting. I do recall, I wasn't playing back then, but there used to be a lending system in RuneScape. What were the pros and cons of that, and what did you guys learn from the lending system?
It was created in the aftermath of the removal of free trade. Now that players could no longer transfer their item to a friend unless their friend transferred wealth of an equivalent amount back, the ability to lend your valuable weapon was severely hampered. So we created item lending, and it had quite a lot of benefits. I mean, for a start, you could safely lend out your item, and there would be no ambiguity about whether you were ever going to get it back again. We'd previously seen, complaint after complaint that I lent my abyssal whip to my friend, and he won't talk to me anymore and won't give it back. So, that wasn't your friend, I'm afraid. It's sad, but apparently an abyssal whip can be worth more than online friendship, they tell me. Yeah, well, anywho, so I've always been luckier than that for online friendships, as far as I know. All that anyone ever really wants from me is, to do things to the game, or maybe add an NPC to the game with their name, or in one case, to marry her, which I did. But I never had anyone try and steal my items that way. Anyway, some drawbacks from it, though, are that now that players could lend their item to anybody, not needing to care if they were trustworthy or not, that meant that they could, charge a fee for doing it. It wouldn't be a very big fee because there was a trade restriction, but within the trade restriction, you could charge, an amount worth having to lend out your item for the day. And therefore, where the Grand Exchange had previously had people offering to sell things, it now filled up with people offering to rent things. And that, I'm not going to say it was a nice thing. We prefer that if you're going to get rich in the game, it'd be nice if you could do it via some gameplay. We weren't really looking to create a scenario where you could get, million coins a day by just sitting in a random exchange spamming for a bit. And 10 minutes later, once you found somebody who'd rent your weapon off you, log out and never think about it again. It's not how we want people to be getting money off each other. It also created a very stark, haves and haves nots. Those who'd got the weapon could get unlimited free money from it, well, within the trade limit. Those who didn't have it were probably never going to get it because nobody had an incentive to sell. And we'd like that players would actually buy and sell these things so that they flow from player to player in the economy, so that more people can have the game experience of owning it without always bringing more of them into the game in total by just having killed the boss for them. So, yeah, we prefer that items be able to flow from player to player, not just be used for milking money for negligible effort. And of course, it does beg the question whether the people who'd got the items in the first place because they could afford to buy them and were now raking in all these coins, what were they doing with these coins? Were they funding real world trading elsewhere? Well, we don't really know. But it feels like the kind of thing that would definitely happen these days if we brought item lending into Old School.
Yeah.
So it's got a lot of benefits, and I actually think they're serious benefits. But in Old School, with no trade limit, I think the drawbacks from back then would be a lot stronger for us in today's game.
Interesting. So in RuneScape 3, they have expanded the GP value limit, and I believe it goes up to 2.1 quintillion, if I'm not mistaken. Something just absolutely absurd. Is there any chance of that happening to Old School?
We've got our engine team working with Mod Lenny on specification for how we can get our Grand Exchange to handle prices over 2 billion so that items can at least be transacted for, well, probably up to that kind of number that you just said, which, well, it's going to need doing in the fairly near future. So that's why the planning's underway. I don't know a date for it getting delivered, but it's something we've got in the pipeline.
Okay. And speaking of some more RS3 updates, I know RS3, I was actually just talking to a couple RS3 players that have transferred over to OSRS, and they have a long history with the game. In RS3, a lot of the skills go beyond 99, and do you think and I mainly ask this just because of the potential downsides in the next few years when it comes to PvP, just having a 99 HP limit with ever increasing powerful weapons. I wonder, does the team ever discuss potential rebalancing of HP limits or stat limits in general going above 99 at some point?
We talk about the possibilities of overbuffs, certainly. In fact, we've got a fair bit in for hit points that overheal you. I think it more likely that we'd focus on that sort of thing rather than addressing the level cap and telling players that the solution for it is to keep training all the way to 200 million XP. I think while that's a logical solution by just expanding the level cap, I think it's a very unpalatable one because it's an extremely long way up there. So I think it more likely that we'd look at designs involving overhealing, damage modification, and mitigations of that nature. That's not necessarily a full team stance, of course, and team stances can always change, especially if players turn out to be wildly, wildly supportive of one approach over others. That really would help. But in terms of the level 99 cap for skills, my concern is that if we say it's now 120, that is a goalpost that's a very long way off, and there ought to be more milestones and unlocks on the way to it. A lot of our skills don't have significant unlocks at each level below 99. And until there's a lot more like that, I'd be very uncomfortable with the idea of taking the 99 goalpost and moving it further away. Because that would be even more trading between significant unlocks and milestones. So that would be my reason for not pushing it for now. And we get a lot of RS3 transfers who see that as the obvious thing and don't see why this is a concern to me at all, or don't mind that there isn't much to unlock, because they just have to keep grinding away at the skill and see the number go all the way to the distant milestone. And fair play to them, but it's not something we're pushing for now.
Okay. So the old school team is obviously much bigger than you dealt with, a decade earlier. So what are some of the pros and cons of working with a smaller team versus now a much larger team with much more, I imagine, ambition and scope for huge updates?
When there were three of us, I could know everything we were doing, give or take. And if there was, and there wouldn't be much going on, so we could all be involved in each other's activity and, share our advice, share our wisdom, and be really quite close knit. It was fun because they felt like friends as well as colleagues, and we chat about family stuff, as well as about the game or about what we were doing at the weekend. We all knew each other and could look out for each other a little. Past the point where there's more like 10 people in the team, there's now more than one project going on at a time, so we don't know each other's projects quite so well. Sometimes you might feel a bit left out because you didn't get to weigh in on details of the other person's project. And ultimately, you should probably suck that up because if everyone in a huge team insisted on poring over every detail of everyone else's project, they might really never get very far on their own. So that was just something we gradually had to get used to, that there were now more things going on than we could keep an eye on ourselves, so more things have to be trusted or delegated. That's sometimes sort of pressure off as well. If a problem arose in the game, there wasn't just one dev who'd have to deal with it. There was maybe 3 devs, any of whom might be able to deal with it. Much better to deal with, but that's a lot less pressure. And more people share the load further, do even more things. It allows us to deliver more for the players, rather than a project having to be done after which we'd need to move on to the next one pretty quick because there'll be no other developer in the team to work on anything else. So if you didn't move on to the next project quick, nothing would happen at all. That was initially a bit of a challenge for us when we had a tiny team. But once we got more people, they could focus on their project for longer and spend longer doing post-release tweaks to it in response to feedback, because they weren't responsible for the next project coming out as well. Someone else was, and they could be doing it in parallel. Now, scale up to the present day, we don't just have 5 developers doing 5 projects. We have 5 scrums of developers or thereabouts, with multiple developers doing bigger projects together. A lot of this reflects players' expectations. If, for example, we put out a new Slayer boss and it was like the thermonuclear smoke devil, players would probably call it a little bit disappointing, I think. But in 2013-14, players knew they were dealing with a tiny team, and they knew the individuals in that team and knew what we were doing and knew our resources. And they were understanding about how, I suppose, the Thermo's Nuclear Smoke Devil wasn't on the scale of an update like Virago in RS3, but players knew why, so they didn't kick off about it. These days, Old School is held to a much higher standard by its players because it can be. They know that there's a lot more staff and there's artists with improved tools than what we used to have, so players will expect the best, and they will say so.
This is actually kind of stemming off another question I have about the art and graphics in Old School, and that fine line that you guys, or at least the artists on the team, must tread lightly, because on one hand you have a lot of the player base that loves the old school look of the game, but there also is an incentive to make the game seem much more polished and potentially a little bit more modern, although trying to keep that balance of old schoolness. What are the challenges basically to maintaining that perfect look with the game? Do the artists struggle? Do you know?
They certainly have had some difficult times over the years. Elves spring to mind. I think the important thing may be to accept you're not going to please everybody, but also get your concepts validated as early as possible, so that you know if you're going in a good direction before you go too far in that direction. The elves were a particularly sore point where, let's face it, our older elf graphics didn't look all that great. We were going to have a quest that was focusing on elves incredibly heavily. So the artists did some new designs that were, well, some of them were a bit purple. Either way, it wasn't something players were expecting, and it wasn't something players felt consulted on. And I think the pre-release feedback should have been handled differently in hindsight. Also, frankly, it doesn't help that when some players are unhappy about the update, they'll say so. Some of them can articulate that what they don't like about it, like the ears look like something out of Star Trek. That's a fair piece of criticism for an elf ear. Rewatching Lord of the Rings, frankly, I think that accusation could be levelled quite fairly there as well. But other players won't or don't. Their view is, well, this is shit. It's shit because it looks shit. And no, what I want instead, something not shit. Tell the artist that. Go on. Look, and with the best will in the world, the artist probably wasn't aiming for shit in the first place. That's this player. Well, clearly the artist's shit then, because they've made something shit, and it's shit because it looks shit. Not some players will go to the effort of saying what they don't like and how they'd like it to be made better. Others will just give you that and claim that's my constructive criticism. It's not my job to design things. You're the job to design things. You're the artists. You're the experts. And it can be a little tricky to find a way of pleasing these players. And some will go even further. It's not beyond problem with the look of the game, but some were very clear that they felt the problem was the individual artist, and that they needed that person to be fired and disgraced and insulted, so they know just how much the elf design is unsatisfactory for the computer game. And the trouble is, once you get that kind of attitude mixed into the more sincere feedback about the art, frankly, there's a lot less incentive to cooperate with the people who wanted the art changed if some of them are behaving that way. It makes the community look bad in ways that, frankly, don't feel like it's a good business move to, cater to them. Because if people are like that, do we need them in the community? Is it maybe better for the rest of the community if these people get upset about elf graphics and go away and take their money with them? So art feedback, which is inherently going to be subjective. I think that's been some of the most difficult, because even people who want to give constructive feedback won't all be able to articulate it in a useful way. But also, the fault is in the team's side in the first place, where we didn't validate the designs publicly enough in advance, and left ourselves in a situation where it would have been extremely difficult to rework things to player satisfaction, even if we could identify what that entailed. And we'd be doing it all in the face of some pretty toxic people who genuinely feel that the best way to say you don't like the art is to insult the artist personally. The internet does lend itself to that, of course. And I imagine if one were to read art criticism going back centuries, lots of learned people writing in scholarly journals have got pretty darn personal at times as well. But it's still not helpful. So I don't think players know this one, but around late 2011, it probably would have been. There was a concept of releasing a game under the title of Dungeon Master. This would be dungeoneering presented separately from RuneScape. So it would be a way of taking a very popular piece of content, dungeoneering, and presenting it as a game in its own right, so that players would be signing up to play Dungeon Master, and they'd log in at the gates of Demonheim and go through a tutorial experience of a Demonheim dungeon raid, and be presented that as the computer game they're getting into. And they would be left to think that was all there was, although if they chose to walk off Demonheim to the south or by the boat, they would be allowed to do so and go play RuneScape, but they'd be doing it through a login screen that said Dungeon Master, and they'd be playing through, I think, dungeonmaster.com even. It was a marketing initiative, really, to get away from what the marketing experts at that time were saying was the tired brand of RuneScape, a game that everyone, had seen and played before and weren't playing now. Some marketing guru said that the solution would clearly be to get them playing RuneScape without them realizing it was RuneScape. So a couple of us, me and I think Mod Raven, were assigned to do some game changes that would, present just dungeoneering as the full game. I would write the tutorial for it, and Mod Raven would change the game frame to Dungeon Master style graphics and hide features that were nothing to do with dungeoneering, like achievement diary side panel and quest side panel, so that it would be a fairly coherent Dungeon Master themed game all by itself. And we were told to try and get that done because it was like late summer, early autumn now, and marketing thought it'd be a really good idea to launch this before the Christmas market rush, which I thought was ambitious, but what the heck, our leaders are allowed to be ambitious, and ideally worked on this. Worked on a design for the tutorial, while Raven made notes about what needed changing in the rest of the game and what engine features would be needed for it, so the engine team could do their side. And, after we presented our designs, Raven's line manager intervened and said he thought that we should swap roles, because he thought that Raven, being a fairly new developer at the time, would not be able to do the very technical game frame work that should be done by Mod Ash, because game frame work is difficult, and he'd have to change the appearance of the login screen, and that's difficult and very technical, and that's obviously something Ash should do. I said, well, I don't think so. It's not that difficult, and also the tutorial is actually quite a lot of work. We have a very short deadline. I think Raven will be absolutely fine on all the technical stuff. I mean, Raven's actually best known for his story work, but he was perfectly competent technically, very talented. So I felt he should be left to do that, and I would try and do the heavy lifting to get the tutorial done in time. But his manager wasn't having any. Insisted, no, you're just being humble, Ash. You should do the technical work. Fine. Well, the technical work consists of if Dungeon Master show this graphic, else show original graphic. What would he fucking do? I believe in all my heart that Raven would have managed it. Anyway, that was how our roles were reassigned. Raven worked to my design for the tutorial. He interpreted a few things a little differently from what I might have meant in my own notes for my own use. Anyway, so marketing took a look at what they were seeing after a couple of weeks of this and said, yeah, it's not really polished enough to be a brand new game on the market. Maybe we shouldn't go for Christmas after all, but take our time to do it properly, which will take many more months, and then it could go out properly another time. And it was never heard from again. I really don't. I didn't really like how in that era there were initiatives that popped out of nowhere and they were suddenly top priority because they were needed urgently. And then after a few weeks, they'd never be heard from again because it wasn't urgent after all. It's, I mean, a fairly senior manager explained to me at the time, we should be pursuing the best opportunity. And if the facts change, of course, our decisions should change. So that might mean pursuing a new opportunity. And yeah, I can see the logic there. If you walk in the best direction at every possible moment, you're always going in the best direction. And as the facts change, your decisions should change. All good. But if you change your mind every 2 weeks, then after a few months, I'm not really sure you'll have achieved a darn thing. And somewhere along the line, there's got to be a balance where you actually put something on the market. Otherwise, what's the point of being a game developer if no player ever receives it because you kept changing your mind about what to write every few weeks? I think they were going a little bit too far in the other direction on this particular phase of our management. But anyway, Dungeon Master went away and never came back. It would have been a very odd thing to launch anyway, because the name Dungeon Master came from some other game that had been launched successfully that people had liked. And we would have just bought that name for a fair price, I'm sure, and put an entirely different game on it, which would in fact be Dungeoneering as a backdoor to RuneScape, so that you could play it without us having to admit it was RuneScape. I'm quite glad this concept went away.
See, this is kind of back in an era. So when I hear Dungeoneering in general, I'm very unfamiliar with it. I've obviously seen some videos on it, but I wasn't actually playing at that time. Do you think Dungeoneering would have a place in Old School?
I think a randomly generated dungeon with group or solo challenges is very welcome in Old School. I think calling it a skill is questionable. In fact, I went and put that question on the last annual survey and asked players to rank to what extent they agreed with the statement Dungeoneering is a minigame rather than a skill. The vast majority of players agreed, it turns out, that it's a minigame. But maybe the world's best minigame. Anyway, I think that kind of gameplay has a place. I think we've occasionally touched in its direction. The Gauntlet springs to mind. It's a fairly obvious reference, really, especially when it comes to the group size and shape. And also James of Zarek in a different way, a simplified form of it. And those have stood the test of time reasonably well. People still go raiding and want to go raiding. And it's not just because of the rewards in there. The Olm has given people years, literally, of trying to puzzle out the mechanics and still find new ways to optimize it. And, a lot of that is fun. of one sort or another. So, do I think dungeoneering should be copied? Now, that'd be a different question. I think I'd settle for just saying there's room for a lot more genuinely randomly generated challenge encounters for solo or group use. And there's a lot of learning points we could usefully take from dungeoneering. But the answer is not necessarily to copy and paste dungeoneering.
That's fair. I know there's some people in the community that are kind of worried, similar to dungeoneering having actually been a skill rather than just a mini game. People are worried about sailing coming out into the game and being a skill rather than just an activity that's in the game that you can now explore the seas. But they're worried about the skill element behind it. Do you have any concerns on that?
Well, it might be a slight tangent, but honestly, I would have very much loved that a piece of content called sailing, where you go on a ship and you go through a randomly generated challenge encounter involving potentially other ships you have to fight off, islands to explore, uniques to bring back from them, and that is a sailing run. That's not in the slightest what our sailing skill is going to be like. I think I'd have had some fun with it. Probably because I'm very fond of the idea of a randomly generated dungeon, to be honest. So, you know, one could have made such a thing, but that is very, very much not what the sailing skill's anything like. I've seen prototypes. There is a lot more focus on you being on your ship, doing sailing related activities with your ship to maneuver around oceans, not because, well, not just to complete a one-off challenge in the style of a minigame, but because from your ship you can access new kinds of challenge that are ongoing parts of the game. In much the same way that going out on going out to do some Slayer is not a mini game. Sailing, going out to use your ship to do some of the things you can do at sea, will not be a mini game. So I'm not worried about it coming across too much like a mini game. I'm also not particularly worried about it coming across as a method of transporting yourself to an island that you should have been able to go to in another way. The core of the skill is very much about what you do with your boat. And while we expect to have some places of interest that you can only reach via these boats, they are not what the skill is all about. So I understand the concern, and how I would have been prone to making that mistake myself, writing the sailing minigame, if, of course, I didn't have any player feedback saying not to do so. But we've seen that players don't want the minigame, and we're not writing a minigame.
Are you worried about the release of sailing? And obviously, this is far away, and there's still so much development to be had and a lot of betas. Are you worried at all about the community imagining sailing being something different than it really is on release, and maybe there potentially being disappointment? Or do you think the opposite, that they'll be pleasantly surprised with it? Do you have any sort of sense as to what to expect on actual release?
I think if you get 5 people, you can get 5 visions of what the word sailing might turn out to mean, including possibly 2 of them who haven't read any of the blogs about the initial designs and who still think it's going to be a mini game, because that's the direction my imagination might have gone to if I hadn't read any player feedback saying not to do a mini game. So what I do expect is that between now and release, a lot more blogs and a lot more playtest opportunities, public ones as well, so that by the time launch comes, I would expect a lot of players, especially the engaged ones, to know what sailing is going to look like and how it's going to play, because they'll have seen it and they'll have maybe even had their hands on bits of it. That, of course, is the minority of people who read the blogs and engage in betas, but it's going to be a very long time by all accounts. It sure as heck ain't going to be 2024. So I think there will be time for an understanding of it to percolate around the community, so that when people do rock up on launch day saying, this isn't what I expected at all, I'd expect quite a lot of players to be able to say with all sincerity to them, well, you clearly weren't paying attention, were you? I don't believe sailing should come as a surprise on the kind of level where people expect it to be completely different. I expect we will have done some very thorough communicating of what it is and taking feedback as players see what it is, so that we can adjust, how boats move, where boats move to, where the focus is, whether bits feel fun or not, maybe.
Th- this
I'd expect us to have a lot of opportunity for that before launch.
Yeah, this definitely seems like the most ambitious skill across both games in my eyes, just simply because of, I mean, just even these early blogs that we've seen. I mean, the navigation itself seems to be a giant step, and I can't even imagine Old School not having a polling system or not having community feedback driven betas and things, because I'm just trying to imagine a world where the Old School team actually just blindly just drops sailing onto us, and well, not them blind, but the community being blind to it, and we just wake up one morning and all of a sudden sailing's in the game. Like, that would be such a tremendous feat to be able to do it without the community at this point. It actually blows my mind that back in the day they used to just do that, just drop a brand new skill into the game without any sort of player testing. Do you think that could even be a possibility at this point with something as crazy as sailing, to just do it
I
without the
think
community?
I think it would be an insane risk, but it would be possible for the Old School team to work on something, not tell anyone about it, and then launch it one day. It'd be possible. It would be, in my view, a very bad idea, and very much more prone to being buggy as well. One of the things that helps about having players actually engaged in this is that, firstly, we went to a lot of trouble to assess that players were actually up for a sailing skill in the first place. If we hadn't even done that, and we were just expecting that our design would be so amazing that players would turn out to want a sailing skill, having never been asked, well, I think we have a very high risk of being wrong. And also, it would be a very different kind of conversation afterwards. As it stands, if a player goes out on social media and says, no one wants sailing, cancel it in advance, well, the player can say it, but there's a lot of, survey evidence saying they're wrong, and they wouldn't really have a very good leg to stand on. Now, they could go out there, and probably will go out there, saying they don't like aspects of the design, and we don't expect everyone to love every aspect of it, because hell, take Varnamore, there's a lot of stuff in there. You're bound to have a favourite bit, and you're probably bound to have a least favourite bit. And there'll be bits that could be usefully improved, like was done with Varnamore over the next month after it came out. I expect sailing to be very much the same. There'll be aspects people love, aspects people want changed, and probably months of post-release changes. Trying to address the little pain points, etc. The idea of putting it out there without any validation up front, though, that's I don't think that would be wise. Now, if you go back to 2006, say, we put out construction with no warning. And we accidentally leaked a picture on the website that showed a room with some furniture in, but players saw the picture but didn't know what it referred to. So it was still pretty much a surprise when at the end of the month, we plan an update where you can sit on chairs. Turned out to be a teaser for the construction skill. And it dropped, and players were astonished. That went well, but old school players aren't accustomed to updates being like that. Old school players are accustomed to having input and consultation, and I do not think they would respond well to finding it being taken away from them on something so significant as a new skill that they will feel encouraged to get to 99.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple questions kind of regarding the team. So one question is, how does player feedback influence the team's development decisions? So I guess what I mean by that is are there ever times where it's very clear the community wants something and the team may actually hold back on what the community is demanding and not give it to them based on their own data that they have? And like, have there been like certain examples of that where you as the team don't give the community what they're demanding?
What the community is demanding can sometimes take the form of, say, a Reddit thread with 10,000 upvotes. And 10,000 is a lot, but it's actually still a small fraction of the community. So we sometimes distinguish between what's trending on social media and what the whole community actually thinks on a given topic. That's, of course, very hand-wavy, but there's a reason we sometimes run polls or run surveys, because we want to be sure we're not just hearing the most upvoted voice in the room. And sometimes, therefore, a player who sees a 10,000 upvoted thread on Reddit could reasonably say this must be what everyone thinks, and therefore consider that we're not doing what the community wanted if we don't go with it. But we will also consider other things that are important to the community, even if they're not talking about that right this minute. Let's take a fairly mundane example from this week. Broav. It's a creature you encounter during while Gothic sleeps, and you can carry it around and use it to do some tracking during the quest. And at the end, you've still got it. Well, you could still have it if you haven't got rid of it somehow. Players, a lot of them, would like to put it in their player-owned house as a menagerie pet. And I don't think there's any dispute that it's something players want. Is that what we're working on right now? No. Is that because we're ignoring what the community wants? But I'd say no, because the team who worked on While Gothic Sleeps are also aware of quite a lot of other things that players have asked for, even if they're not getting quite as much, cutesy hype as the Brewav threads. There's feedback about whether the quest NPCs are hard enough to fight, feedback about the engagement with the tormented demons, feedback, a few things to fix about their shield mechanics that have been fixed as far as I know, or at least the last round of them have been anyway. And that is also delivering on things the community cares about. It's not, therefore, that we should have... We wouldn't feel we should go with the biggest thread first, because that's the most important thing to the community, and make it all about the Proav. I hope we will get to the Proav. We're not promising it for now, but we've acknowledged it publicly as something we might get to do. But first, we're going to address some other things. And I would say that by addressing those other things, we are also acting on the community's desires and in their interests, even if it's not exactly what they're all saying loudest. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, that is. Actually, on the topic of While Gothic Sleeps, this seems to be pretty simple because we've seen it in the past a lot. But how much goes into changing NPCs entirely? Like, Now Duradel is Curadel, and Neve was replaced by Steve. Is there any sort of like I don't know, is that difficult to code in an entirely new NPC for certain players, or is that pretty easy breezy at this point to just do something like that?
It will always depend on what the NPC was doing and how much, therefore, needed changing to handle that their name and stance may be different. Now, if the NPC only does a few select things, like Neve was just a Slayer Master, she wasn't also the reward NPC for an entire combat achievement system like Gommel. So Neve was fairly easy to do. And what made it easier is that Steve was made the same shape so that he could use the same stats. And therefore, we just had to find all references to her in the Slayer code and make sure the name would update, which it often would because it's inherited automatically from the NPC. And we've got good infrastructure for making their names and appearances update based on quest progression. So a lot of the Slayer code would handle Neve and Steve automatically. And we'd only have to do manual things when it came to the Lunar spellbook interface that contacts NPCs. Things like that. So that wasn't too hard. I actually did that one, if I recall correctly, back in 2016. Duradel also not too widely used outside of Slayer, so not too bad. I think the Gommel one would have been a bit harder.
Yeah, and apparently that I think I heard some news that model is going to be changed slightly. I don't think people were satisfied with what it ended up looking like.
Well, how should I put this? It's a little cringe, don't you think, dearie? Yeah. I looked at the RS3 version of the NPC in question, and okay, there's definitely similarities, but the RS3 one's got trousers on, and I think that's an improvement. So yeah, I would welcome some short trousers on the version we've got, but I'm not precious about it, and I wasn't really going to go around scrutinising the gnome's nethers in that level of detail anyway. It's not really my thing, but if anyone's got the time to do some trousers in the graphics department, I know where to put them.
Okay. Are there any elements in particular that are prioritized in order to maintain the balance of nostalgia in old school? I feel like updates going forward, especially things that are not just translated over from RS3 to OSRS, but brand new updates that you guys are creating. What is talked about amongst the team in regards to trying to maintain that nostalgia? Are there like certain key things that you guys keep in mind when designing new updates and monsters and locations?
I'm gonna have to say I don't really have the vocabulary to talk about art styles in any detail. A lot of previews and concepts will be shared in advance. So players confronting Varlamore, for example, which is a huge new landmass with places you've never been before, based on cultural references we've never used before, there'd have been a very high risk of it not feeling like an old school place. But it's made by the same artists who've been making old school art for, well, 9 years in one case. And mostly their stuff goes down okay. And players got to see previews. I don't just mean from the leak either. I mean, players got to see blogs with designs in and characters in. I was seeing feedback before launch about some player raised concerns that we were parodying Native American culture, and no, this is actually taken from an entirely different culture and has been done with, as far as we could, full respect for that culture. It's not Native American anyway. Um, they weren't the only people with access to feathers, frankly. So a lot of those discussions could happen before launch, and if there was significant murmuring that they didn't like the look of the assets and the environment, there would have been time to do something about it. But broadly speaking, as far as I know, Varlamore went down extremely well, and the only concerns we had in the weeks before launch were whether it was going to be bad for the frame rate, and that too, I think, was addressed pretty well.
Yeah, I think the overall sentiment is Varlamore was a huge success, and I think most of us, I mean, I'm going to speak for the community. I'm really excited for part 2 and part 3. I think it's going to be amazing. So,
Excellent. We know there's some pretty high expectations, of course, on
there are.
the after part 1, which is partly why. Well, let's see. It's July at the moment. Okay, we would never have tried to get part 2 out quite by now, but the reason it's not imminently on the horizon is that we're taking a bit more time to try and deliver on those expectations. So you'll get it later this year. It isn't going to be in the summer.
That's totally fine. I think it's best to wait and just make sure it's really good.
Yeah, that's been a thrust of a lot of player feedback that players are increasingly patient so long as what they get at the end of it be good. And that's also a very strong influence on the sailing designs and decisions, because it's been a long time since the poll where players confirmed, yes, go ahead and give us a sailing skill. And, blogs have been sparse in the last couple of months. We regret that, but we are taking the time, as players have always argued that we should. And I'm afraid this is sort of part of it. I look forward to when we can next show, some boat movement for the players. And I also look especially forward to an open tech alpha where players can get their hands on it and get their keels wet.
Yeah. So this is definitely a change in topic, but so PvP has been in RuneScape since the dawn of time, it seems like, and there seems to be, at least on Reddit, a large group of players that have no interest in anything PvP related, and they would probably say that without the wilderness, the game would be just as well off. But then there's also a portion of the player base that thinks PvP is absolutely vital to Old School's success in the future and its health. Where do you lie on this continuum of the importance of PvP and the wilderness in general? How important is it to maintain that old school feel of the wilderness and the high risk nature of it? And does the team have any plans on altering what the wilderness is? Do you think it's overall healthy for the game? And will we see any changes, big changes in the future?
I got asked a very similar question when I had the job interview for product manager. What they asked me was, you have frequently argued that we should actually commit to delivering more for the PvP community, and you've always been rebuffed on the argument that they are a small cohort. Why would we put time and trouble into that when we could be serving a much bigger audience with every update? The answer I gave is that that cohort punches above its weight in terms of value. A lot of the fun and engaging videos about RuneScape are players fighting each other. I mean, to be sure, Settled is going to be the iconic example of player created content, I think, and the series is with Swampletics, etc. But PvP it's got scope for more emergent gameplay, and that keeps it interesting and fresh, much more efficiently than we could try and do by designing emergent gameplay into PVM mechanics. frankly, if you get significantly emergent behavior from a PVM encounter, it's probably broken, frankly. Whereas PvP will find new tactics that both sides can use because they're both players who can try the same kind of thing. And that may keep it fresh for longer, give people the scope to make their own entertainment. But to do that, sometimes you do need to still cater them a little. But in return, they'll produce a lot more content across the internet that is, from our point of view, free marketing. They participate in Deadman events, which have significant viewer counts. And even if they are a minority cohort within the community, I argued, therefore, that by delivering a little for them, it'll be totally worth it to keep them around. And we weren't asking for them for, a 8-month project taking up their whole team's time that would only cater to those players. Because a lot of what they were asking for was on a smaller scale anyway. So I argued that it would be worth it. And under Mod Marcos, the current executive producer, he duly allowed for there to be a PvP scrum setup, now featuring mods Manked and Dizon. Manked actually really does know his stuff in this field too. And they've been able to deliver a cadence of content and mechanic changes for that community that can make a difference for them, rather than going with the attitude from before where somebody at a rather much higher level told me, well, I just don't see the numbers for it, Ash. That's because I think he hadn't looked or didn't know where to look. He was looking at, I mean, that guy's gone now, but he was senior VP for us. And he would be looking at updates in terms of this comes out, membership numbers go up. This comes out, membership numbers go up by less. Therefore, the first one was a better update. And that's a very limited way to see it. But if you don't have any way of tracking, retention, and all you can see is numbers going up or down alongside the timeline of when updates come out, yeah, it's going to be very hard to see the value of quite a lot of stuff that's important to players. I tried arguing from the point of view of the value, of recognising the value of the emergent gameplay and the created content and the viral marketing opportunities. And at least for the moment, Old School RuneScape is allowing us to invest a little for that.
Do you think
That's where I stand.
do you think there's any downside to the player? I don't know how to describe, like, basically the player experience when it comes to the average player walking out into the wilderness to do a Slayer task or to do something out there and getting killed and losing their stuff and feeling really bad about their experience out there and wanting to quit the game or wanting to, just, take a break. Do you think there's any downside to that? And when I was talking again to Wazzy and Mikaru from RS3, they've said in RS3 that there's an opt-in, opt-out system with the wilderness. And do you think there is any potential for that? I don't know how I feel exactly about that, but I'm very curious what you think about a kind of system like that going forward, so that players that have absolutely no interest in PvP can still do their wilderness activities that they need to do.
I think we would drill further into need to do. Now, there's some stuff that players will feel very, very strongly encouraged to do. Like if you're 5 steps into a clue scroll and you're led into the wilderness, you've got a very strong incentive to do it and hope to get your loot, rather than abandoning the clue and hoping that your next clue won't take you that way. But we have largely designed content up there to not be obligatory. There are exceptions. Earth Warriors spring to mind, But we don't tend to do that kind of thing much these days. Sending you on a task that will lead you there and cannot be skipped. There's a reason it's got an entirely separate Slayer Master, after all. So, we are, while it's not like an option to just wander around the place in complete safety because you've opted out of being at risk, but a lot of what you need for most of the game's content doesn't take you there. And you can have a lot of fun across a lot of RuneScape without going there. I appreciate it's not satisfactory for some because they still feel that they would prefer to be able to tick off, the boss kill counts, get the uniques from those as well. Even if a lot of those uniques were designed slightly more for use in the wilderness where you didn't want to be yourself anyway.
Yeah, no,
I
I think
appreciate it's not satisfactory, but that is, for the moment, still the philosophy in Old School. It can always change.
that seems reasonable, and you are right. I think the team actually has struck a pretty good balance with the wilderness items that you're getting being exclusively really good to use in the wilderness itself, and I think that's pretty important. I just know
There's
there
also the
are.
matter about
Yeah, go.
sorry. There's also the matter about losing things on death and feeling you want to quit. Now, a lot of Old School RuneScape is pretty forgiving about death. You die, you get back to your gravestone quickly. You pay not too big a fee. You get back to your gravestone slowly, or get it more conveniently from death's office. You pay a bigger fee, but the items stay. Thing is, death is meant to be discouraged in Old School still. It's not, completely free anywhere. Or it's not completely free in anywhere outside safe mini games, should we say. So if you go out somewhere dangerous with your valuables, yeah, you take a risk with them. It's normally a coin risk, but in some areas it's a risk of complete loss. And that's meant to be a reasoned risk you chose to take. And if you wanted to go somewhere with lower risk, then maybe take welfare gear, even if that means it's not going to be your best stuff for handling an NPC at the end. If you want to take better gear, we consider you to be taking the risk of losing that better gear. That way, to some extent, your welfare gear might even have more use, because you might choose to take it somewhere and choose to own it so you can keep taking it somewhere for times where you don't want to risk your best stuff. Now, faced with that, a player might, in all sincerity, say, no, I don't like the feeling of taking more risk and losing more. It's not how I like to play a game. Change it. And, in future, we arguably could. But for the moment, Old School remains a game with some actual risk of losing value on death. We will, I think, eventually change the behaviour of the permanent grave stores, like Torfin, the Priestess Gwenwinig, the Theatre of Blood chest, the ones where if you die while the items are in there, they actually do get lost. I think in all likelihood we will change it so they either stack up there or go to Death's office or something like that. So that those PVM deaths don't take out your items completely. That I do expect us to change.
That would be nice.
Yeah. It was, in some way, harkening back to the legacy behaviour of RuneScape that a lot of players will still say was the good old days, where if you died to PVM, you were almost certainly going to lose your stuff, because anyone could pick it up, and there's no guarantee they'd find you and give it back to you. And it would only stay on the ground 2 minutes as well. We've moved a long way from there, and some would say that's dumbing down the game. I would say it's making the game more like what they want to play, and that's why there's more players. It, as always, be a balancing act to decide which side to go towards. For the moment, this is where we stand, and the one change I do see in the likely future is to the permanent death stores that can delete your items completely.
Yeah. Okay, this I have to cross this by you. This is something I've been very passionate about thinking of, and it came to my knowledge just a month ago on a cast. Somebody brought up the idea. World of Warcraft has done something similar to this, and basically the idea is a separate game mode that comes out to Old School. That is a hardcore main mode, but it's on a separate server entirely. So there'd be a list of worlds where only these hardcore mains can go. It would be a reset server with the Grand Exchange. People can freely trade. There's a fresh new economy. Everyone starts at level 3. And everybody on that server has only one life. And when you die, your account is wiped entirely. And the whole concept of it really got me excited about something like this for Old School coming out, and just the excitement of every single person you see on the world only having one life, and just the very, very high risk nature of it. The wilderness being an absolute just crazy place to go to, knowing that everybody out there has one life, and so the risks are just extreme. And also places like Theater of Blood, where instead of getting caged when your teammate dies, he just actually vanishes from the game mode. And something very, very high stakes like this sounds super exciting. And the people I've talked to about it all are very, very excited. I just had a cold one on last week, and he was just thrilled about the idea. I want to cross it by you simply to just springboard this idea into the minds of some of the devs. But do you have any... I'm just asking you personally, would this be something you would like to see, a concept like this in Old School?
Yes, the idea of playing with just one life has always been somewhat appealing. I mean, to be sure, we've got Hardcore Iron Man, but that comes with a whole lot of other baggage around it that isn't what everyone's looking for in their gaming experience. So the idea of trying to play without dying at all genuinely appeals to me. I hoped, to be honest, that we'd get to feature creep an item into the game that shows whether you have ever died, so that players who had never died on a main could prove it. I mean, it might be a simple thing like some flowers in Lumbridge that grow up on a little memorial the first time you die, just so that forever after it's clear that you did die. But I've always liked that idea. So a separate mode based on it, yeah, that sounds like an extra exciting version. And it doesn't sound very hard to do, because what you've described is basically fresh start worlds with a one life rule.
Yep, exactly that. And there were people, because I've talked about this on my stream as well, people asking, oh, would this have accelerated XP rates? Would it have increased drop rates? I would honestly say no. I say keep it the exact same as the main game. And just knowing that everybody around you has never died would just be such a different vibe. It'd be kind of eerie in a way, but knowing that you can freely boss with people and you're not restricted to Iron Man rules feels a lot more liberating and a lot more fun and community driven. And knowing that that whole world actually has no Iron Man on it, everyone is the same type of mode actually sounds kind of fun.
I've seen a lot of players say they'd love a world with no irons on it, but that's another matter entirely.
Yeah. And then the Iron Man that don't want, they just want their Iron Man only worlds. So, but yeah. Anyway, I figured I would cross that because that's something that I know for a lot of players would reinvigorate a lot of passion into this game. People that are feeling a little bit dull, mainly people that have put in 10,000 plus hours at this point and have a reason to maybe not feel as excited about the game. So
I do see that, well, having permanently died on it, you'd presumably, well, if you wanted to play it anymore, you'd make another character and go into it with that. And I guess there wouldn't be any limit on people doing so because we wouldn't be able to enforce the IP limit in a useful way for it. So it might be that people just kept coming back, and some of them might be griefers in some way who just make disposable accounts to try and get other people killed. But on the other hand, getting somebody killed on purpose, well, it's not something just any level 3 can go in and do.
Yep.
So I'd hope it wouldn't be an issue. Anyway, so I like the idea, and it doesn't sound very hard to do. Committing to having those worlds around perpetually is, obviously it's an ask,
Yes.
but it's not an unreasonable ask because we do it for other things.
Yeah, what it would have to almost do is, I mean, I'd imagine if it doesn't want to turn into like a permanent dead man mode where it's just this is now perpetually in the game for the end of time, you'd almost have to make some stance on, okay, if we don't see growth or if we don't see the player excitement, we're going to only have this run for 1 year or something. But if it hits a certain threshold, then we'll continue it for, another year or a year after that or something where it could potentially end if it just absolutely dies. But there is a chance that, it could just keep going. That would be,
Well, there could be
yeah.
it could be high scores based. Say, even just say, we will do this for a period of say 6 months, and at the end, this will be wiped. But those who were at the tops of the high scores will receive some tribute, or maybe even something in real world value. That's a right pain to do, by the way, because for data protection reasons, we're not allowed to just mail stuff to the customers because they haven't opted into that. But in theory, there could be real world prizes or some other kind of reward, free membership or something. And that all sounds like it's existing infrastructure still. And by doing it on a 6-month fixed period trial, we get to see if there's interest, and it will become a lot more apparent whether there's an appetite for a permanent one during that.
Yes.
At the very least, it would be a finite way of exploring it with finite resources. And as I'm not aware that Fresh Start Worlds are planned again for Old School at the moment, that means that it wouldn't get in the way of them.
I would love to see it. That's me coming as a player, and the people I've talked to, most everybody has agreed. Like, okay, this would be really exciting. Not everyone would say they would play it. Some people are very still, hooked on their main accounts, me included in a way. But I still would love to explore a different server entirely. I think that'd just be super super fun. So that would probably be the
Yeah,
way to do it. Do a 6-month trial.
I wouldn't hop to it either myself because I've always preferred to treat the game as a world where my achievements are what they are, and trying not to hop between different versions of my character that have trained different ways. But on the other hand, a heck of a lot of players don't see the world that way, and therefore a lot of them would probably jump straight to this thing. After all, Fresh Start Worlds did get used. I wouldn't say it was hugely popular in the way that leagues are, by the way. Leagues, as far as I know, have performed a lot better for getting players engaged. But this would have a more interesting twist with the YOLO rule.
Yeah.
So maybe it would perform better than Fresh Start World did before.
Yeah, I can't even imagine the swapping rates. Knowing that everyone's a main and can trade, if you pull a scythe or you pull a twisted bow, because I would imagine there wouldn't just be the normal hardcore Iron Man restrictions, there'd be the group hardcore Iron Man restrictions where everything is dangerous, including chambers. So getting an Infernal Cape or getting a T-bow or a scythe would just be a monumental achievement, and the swap rates, I'm imagining, would just be sky high. So I think
Safe deaths would also be dangerous in those places. Wow, that's going to be hardcore, right?
yeah. Yeah. And the other just absolutely tragic thing I can already imagine if this did come out is like, I don't know if you've seen people PK each other at Bloat, where they purposely fly them, but they're wearing the Phoenix necklaces and they're chilling. imagine an absolutely horrific prank of they're not getting caged here. They're out of the world entirely, and you just PK them. The last thing I guess I'll touch on, something that just makes me super excited, is the wilderness. Is that would truly be the most terrifying place to ever be. And what I would love to see in a server like this are clans, PK clans that really try to take over sections of the wilderness. But knowing that everybody out there has one life, including those clans, the strategy involved in taking over an area would be absolutely crazy. I mean, just knowing that, okay, your clan's geared up to try to take on this new clan. How are you going to pick them apart one by one? Or, what are the strategies in order to clear this clan? And I just think the whole idea of the wilderness with everyone having one life is absolutely thrilling. And the content creation scene would be wild, I think.
Excellent. And well, given what I said earlier about my argument for why we should invest in PvP content, being that one of the ways it pays back is through content creation. It's obviously very convenient for me to find opportunities that help prove that was right.
Yeah, that would be like the biggest driver, at least in viewership, would just be I think the wilderness aspect of that. It's so weird though, because it would be so different, because most of the time you're not seeing hardcore Ironman PK. But this would be not the Ironman aspect, but just hardcore's PKing is really riveting. And I think there would also be a return of low-level PKing. The classic stuff that I used to do as a kid, where you'd walk up that Varrock path past the yew tree to that little multi-section fire striking everybody. Because I think with the amount of deaths you'd occur if you are participating in PvP in this server, you'd almost want to just stay a low level and have a lot of fun being that low level type out in multi with your friends, having these strategic fights, and then knowing that it doesn't take 100 or plus hours to rebuild an account to a certain level, but it only takes, maybe tens of hours to train up again to that point. I think that would be exciting.
Yeah, I do like this. Thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, no, I'm glad. I'm glad you took it well.
Oh, hell yeah.
Okay, so one of the questions that we're kind of wrapping up on questions that I have, but is there anything you've noticed in the old school community? I guess the sentiment or the feeling or the culture that has changed over the last 11 years. Are there any trends you notice over time with the community at large?
Players harking back to the good old days are less prevalent than when we began. When we launched in 2013, of course, players were very much aware that the game had come back from a version. Well, they got this 2007 version again, and they got it because they were unhappy with changes made in 2012 in other RuneScape. So there was a very, very strong focus from the community about protecting this one, not letting it change too much, and setting it in resin almost so that it would never change, lest the change be a bad change years down the line. And initially, there was even arguments that it all went downhill when God Wars turned up, because that brought all these OP weapons and loot rates, and really ruined the game to some of these people. And within months, we got from players commenting while frequently God Wars was OP, to players saying, if you don't do God Wars now, the game will die. Get off your asses and do it. Jagex, you're lazy. It's like, well, we have no map editor and one dev. But thankfully, we've got a map editor. We really couldn't have done it without a map editor. But then we did it, and players were fine with it, and numbers started going up as well, because more players started sticking around and coming back again. So that was how quickly that sentiment could change in even just 2013. Fast forward another 11 years, and the players who really, really don't want any change at all are very much more of a minority. Now, that's to some extent understandable, because if you didn't want any change and then you probably wouldn't have stuck around for 11 years while we keep adding things. But, they can see at every step that most of these changes are things that the vast majority of players want. There aren't that many, frankly, legislatures that will subject things to a 70% support rate before it will go through. I think the US Senate uses 2/3 for some things. But 70% is a really quite high threshold of support for something. Certainly compared to, say, Britain leaving the EU based on 52%. Anyway, I mean, that was the rule, so of course we did it. But the fact that a player in the community can see that if a poll doesn't go their way, they're probably in a small enough minority that they'll understand and not mind too much, or at least feel that it's in somebody's interest. That's important. And therefore, we might still have some people around who would have preferred there be no updates. But I think there's a lot fewer of them than there used to be. And what we get more often these days are players who are comfortable seeing the game grow, but still, of course, very concerned about what directions it may take, which is probably why these questions come up to us, to you and to me. I think it's just an evolution of how players want the future of Old School to be. And mostly they want it to be thriving. Majority these days are very comfortable with there being updates, especially convenience updates, I'm finding. And there's a lot less tolerance of an inconvenience. We can never get away these days with launching something like Dagon's Kings, where they're down the bottom of a 6-story dungeon, accessed from an island. These days, you give somebody tormented demons down a hole, and the first request, other than the one about the Broav, is, can we have a teleport to the hole?
Yep.
And so of course that's being handled. Players didn't used to see things that way. There was more, I think, tolerance of inconvenience and acceptance that this remote, unexplored expanse wasn't next to the bank, or doesn't have a convenient dude who will carry your loot home for you. And if you died in it, you'd probably lose stuff a lot more than you do in Old School these days. It's just the way people's expectations have evolved in the same way the game's evolved, and it's maybe self-perpetuating. And maybe that's dangerous in the very long term. But as far as I can tell, if the vast majority of players are comfortable with something, we should at the very least take it seriously, unless we've got a very strong reason to think that it will work out very badly for them in a way that they're not considering.
Yeah.
That can sometimes be a thing, by the way. Players who want something won't always know as many drawbacks of it as we might. So the answer is that we should tell them.
Yeah, no, there definitely are. We've seen it in the game. I mean, just every single update that seems very innocent, even something as simple, and it seems totally reasonable to give a collection log or a MechScape with perks. We see the downsides of that. Now, I think arguably there's way more upsides, but a lot of the time we don't even consider what the potential downsides of these things are and how they affect just the mindset of the players. I mean, because nowadays, this is the example I always bring up. If you wanted to have a clue scroll expansion at this point, it would be very, very hard to just add uniques to previous tiers, knowing that there are a good number of players that have green logged these things in the collection log, and having to re-obtain items, even if they're the same drop rate. I mean, just having to do basically that many clues that they've done once again just to green log it, people would be very, very upset. So that used to not be a problem pre collection log.
And that's one of the things we're going to have to address if the topic of a completionist cape sticks around, which it probably will, because it's been a hot topic among players bubbling around for the last decade, and also among some of the team. We tend to get a completionist cape pitch or something like one in each game jam. So we didn't last time, but we could have done. Anywho, if we do that, then it's suddenly going to be a disincentive for those players to want more updates. And
Yes.
we'd rather not put them in a position where they are incentivized not to want more updates. We
Yep.
prefer them to welcome more updates and enjoy them, rather than seeing them as chores that they must now complete in order to maintain some status. And we certainly don't want them to feel disadvantaged if they don't or can't, because that's an even bigger reason for them not to want more game updates.
Yeah. It's important to just see all those avenues.
Yeah.
Are there any old school YouTubers or streamers that you watch or series that you've seen? I'm curious.
I don't get to follow a lot of them in detail, but I was, of course, very pleased to work on the broken rune crossbow that's mysteriously lying on the ground near the haunted mine, where a famous streamer had a slight whoopsie at some point. I quite like doing little subtle references like that aren't that don't mean anything if you don't know what they are. But for those who did watch, it's something that they can cheer when they see it. Iron Man came from creators, and in the particular case of UIM, the Ultimates, inspired by Foe, I believe, that mode is not something we'd ever have, probably never thought of it ourselves or formalized it if he hadn't done what he did and inspired so many others to want to do likewise, that sure we end up formalizing it. But what strikes me is that whenever I come across UIM business in my timeline, as like as not, it's from an ultimate saying, "Can you do this update? Or let me store this item." Well, we could, but really, you really sure that what you want in your mode is more storage? Is that not maybe taking away the point of your mode if we keep doing these things for you? And sometimes the UIM community will actually be quite supportive, but no, it makes sense that we'd be able to store this thing in that place. It's not going to be used anywhere else. Makes sense. And others might see it as, devaluing the mode. So I'm cautious around those requests, but they sure do keep coming because, well, in the same way that people play standard iron mode and they therefore have a lot less access to items, and then contact us saying the game isn't very well designed for me to get the items I want. Well, yeah, we know why, but to them it makes perfect sense that we should change it.
Modash, I have one last question for you before we wrap things up. And that is, what advice would you give to aspiring game developers that are looking to create something just as impactful as Old School?
This may seem slightly unexpected, but in all seriousness, don't offer to get your knob out around the workplace. It never ends well. And I mean, I would have thought it went without saying, but it doesn't. I got my big break in Jagex, courtesy of one of the QA staff turning out to have been sending unsolicited dick pics to the customers. Like, who does that? Anyway, so there's gross misconduct, and then there's this entirely spectacular level of gross misconduct. Um, so of course he was gone, and I got bumped up from support to QA to fill the place because they didn't have any other slack to fill the vacancy. Um, and that was probably instrumental in my career taking off at Jagex. So I must thank that guy and his knob, although I did hear that he had to get a new fiance after that particular peccadillo. And I don't blame her for getting shot of that. Also, years later, I had a line manager, and I mean, he was a mature and professional guy, but I also remembered when he'd been a bit younger, and there'd been an unfortunate incident where a lot of staff were bought T-shirts, team T-shirts that were extra small rather than the size they'd ordered, which obviously they weren't very pleased about. Um, one member of staff actually put hers on and stood in the office wearing it like that to highlight the problem, at which point all work stopped in that vicinity. But uh, this guy, he was saying, "Oh, if they don't want the extra small T-shirt, give it to me because I'll turn it upside down and wear it as Y fronts, and it'll have a big hole in the bottom." And
Oh
he
no.
went on that he could get his wang out through it, and kept chatting about that until the rest of us kind of left the kitchen. And
Jesus
also I had
Christ.
years later, so years later, he was my line manager and had to, try and rein me in when I was occasionally a little unprofessional, which happens. Um, he and I would both have this memory in our minds. I don't think it helped him. And then also, there was a lovely guy who ran the RuneScape team for a bit. I really miss him because he was very supportive, and he got drunk one night and went on a live stream of his own. And he signed off by saying, "Now, I'm not speaking for RuneScape. I'm not speaking for Jagex. I'm speaking for this bottle of vodka here because I love it. And if I get 4,000 subscribers tonight, I will get out my cock. Good night." And that
No.
kind of ended his career at Jagex because even though he'd not done it under Jagex's auspices, it was very. You can't have somebody doing that kind of thing. We've got customers under 18. They don't want to be. It's not okay. For that matter, there was I knew a streamer who'd he lived around here, so we met him in the pub occasionally, and he was telling he was telling me how he'd be on stream and he was doing barrows, and he'd asked his viewers, "What should I do if what should I do if I get a barrows item in this chest?" And somebody went and posted, "Get your knob out," and he got a barrows item, and he duly got his knob out,
No,
and
no.
this had been screenshotted because people do that kind of thing. And once it's out there in every sense, it's not going away. And when he was telling me about this, I said, "Hang on, somebody sent me a picture on Twitter the other day showing a room with a computer showing the barrows on screen and somebody with his knob out." And he advised, "Oh, that Mordash had seen his knob." But at this point, I couldn't think what to say. So I said, "Congratulations." Because I thought it was the politest thing to say about what I'd seen. I mean, but it turns out that didn't make the awkwardness go away. um,
Oh my god.
so, in all seriousness, why it should go without saying, if you are one of those who comes equipped with a point and shoot urinary system, don't get it out or offer to do so. It never goes well.
That is brilliant advice. So for those
Yes, it
that
isn't always. It isn't often called a point and shoot urinary system, but you know what I mean.
oh my god. All right,
Yes.
Mod Ash, this has been another amazing conversation. I'm very fucking grateful for your willingness to come on. This has just actually been an absolute treat having you on for 2 casts within just a couple months. So
Well,
now,
thank you
yeah,
for letting me back again and for marking my anniversary in such a fun way, and also for the really useful idea about fresh start hardcore worlds, and for letting me ramble. I've had a great time. I hope your audience has been okay with it, and uh, thanks for a lovely day.
thank you very much. Guys, go drop a follow if you guys are interested in following Mod Ash on Twitter. Gonna have his link down there. And if you guys want to check out his previous episode, I'll also have that linked in the description. You can check it out. And thank you all for listening. Mod Ash, thank you once again. And everyone, we'll catch you in the next one. Peace.